All right, here we are in our fourth and final week. Aren't you glad? Fourth and final week. And again, doing the same thing, I just want to overview a few artifacts and a few passages, a few issues that have some sort of clear touch point with archaeological stuff as it pertains, in this case, to the New Testament. So the first three, forget that, that's my typo slide. The first 3 weeks we were doing Old Testament. Yeah, that's 3/4 of your Bible, so I consider that fair as a breakdown. I wonder if we thinking about killing a light here, but I don't know if it matters. See if you can kill a light near the screen.
There's a glare coming from that door too.
This one? Okay. Yeah, because there's a few inscriptions here. This first one, you may have heard of it. It's pointed out in a lot of study Bibles. This is known as the Pilate inscription, P-I-L-A-T-E, not P-I-L-O-T. Okay. And it's important because it mentions Pontius Pilate. Now, right here is the line. I put a little, get the graphic up here. This is P-I-L-A-T-U-S, again in the old Roman script, Pilatus. And prior to that is what's left of Pontius. So this is a specific object found in the Holy Land that references Pontius Pilate. Obviously an important figure in the New Testament. Part of what scholars think was some sort of, again, decree he made about something or other. It's not specifically about Jesus or something like that, but it shows, Pontius Pilate was not just a person we read about in text, but a real person. We have another one here, the Gallio inscription. Gallio was a Roman official mentioned several times in the Gospels. He's part of the trials, the legal trials of Paul. And the inscription here, let's just go back here and pick up the line. Right here in the middle, and we have in this lettering G-A-L-L-I-O, Gallio. And again, the importance of this one is that in this inscription, there are some circumstances about Gallio's office and what he was doing specifically that allow people, and through other Roman records, allow Gallio's office holding and the relevance to the Acts story to get a specific date according to Roman records. So this is actually kind of a linchpin object for dating at least the latter part of the life of the Apostle Paul. Now, Paul's beginnings are a little murkier in terms of exact dates, but when you get to the latter part of his life, when he begins the sequence of being on trial that ultimately leads to his time with Caesar, this inscription actually provides kind of a hook, a chronological hook, which is why it's important. The Caiaphas ossuary. Anybody know what an ossuary is? It's a bone box. Okay? Doesn't ossuary just sound so much nicer, so much more elegant? Get into a little bit about burial in biblical times. And this, haven't you ever wondered, we'll just park in here in the Old Testament a little bit, like when somebody dies during the patriarchal narratives and they're out wandering around the desert, haven't you ever wondered, what do they do with that? What do they do with the body? Because, you can't just carry the body around because, wild animals will smell it and pursue you, which is probably not a good thing. So what they would do in the Old Testament was they would boil the corpse. And then they would boil it just like you would like a chicken until the flesh falls off the bones. Then you would collect the bones and put them in some sort of container so that on your journey back to your ancestral homeland, like where you had your burial plot. Then they would inter the bones. But you could not just transport a corpse around the desert. Now, in New Testament times, for instance, about the only real thing we get is indications of like Lazarus and of course Jesus, and you're put in the tomb for 3 days and whatnot. The practice was normally you inter someone in a tomb, okay, like a rock-hewn tomb. It depended on what you could afford. And then after a year, the body would have decomposed, and then the bones were collected and then reinterred in one of these. So that either this could be interred in either the same or a different tomb. Again, depending on what you could afford. Does your family, have like a family tomb, that kind of thing, where you move the bone boxes and you put them on the shelf, and kind of a mausoleum sort of thing. That was the normal practice. So that's what's called, using the bone boxes is what's called secondary burial. So if you come across that term, that's what they're referring to. This one is kind of important. You can see it's very ornate. This is a lot of handwork. Lots of handwork means somebody took a lot of time to carve this, which means, in turn, they got paid for their time. So this is the kind of thing that someone who had some means could afford to have fashion for them. And right over here, on the left side, is an inscription. And you can barely make it out here. But the last 3 letters here are the Q, the P, and an Aleph. This is how you spell Caiaphas in Aramaic. Bar is son. So I've seen different renderings of this. Most sources will say this says Joseph, even though this is a really sloppy P, final P instead of a medial P right here. But let's go with it. Joseph, son of Caiaphas. So this is not Caiaphas's bone box, it's his son's bone box, but it is the name of the high priest at the time. And scholars can date a bone box by the patina, in or outside. They can date it paleographically. It's a little less secure by virtue of what the letter shapes look like. There are people who have spent years and years of their life collecting inscriptions and making, literally, like emoji lists. Okay, little letter shape, tabulations of letter shapes on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of inscriptions. And when you come up with something in an inscription that is datable, person's name, especially if they're an official that you find in the Roman records and whatnot, that allows you to start pegging certain letter styles to absolute dates chronologically. And so people actually work out a typology of letter shapes that will help you date an object that has no specific date on it. That's the way it's done. So this one matches the right time period. Caiaphas is an important New Testament name, and this is considered authentic. We're going to hit a couple of these that there's some real questions about. But this is the Caiaphas ossuary. Another, switching gears here from objects to sites, we can talk a little bit about Banyas. And this I bring up because it has just such an interesting backstory element with the Gospels. And I've written about this in my book a good bit. But Banyas, or goes by the name Panias, Paneas, in the New Testament time, this is Caesarea Philippi. Okay? Located at the foot of Mount Hermon, which was a bad place to a Jew. Mount Hermon was where the Watchers descended, the sons of God in Genesis 6. This is the place that all of the intertestamental literature has them coming to hatch their plot to mess with human women. So Mount Hermon was a spooky place to a Second Temple Jew. This place, located at the foot of Mount Hermon, is a couple miles from Dan, which in the Old Testament was also called Laish. It was the center of Baal worship in the northern kingdom. It was known in non-biblical texts as the gates of hell, the gateway to the underworld, because Baal was lord of the dead. Baal Zabul, Eretz, in Ugaritic The Alzabul sound familiar? It should. In Ugaritic, it means Prince Baal. It became a template name for Satan to Christians and to Jews living in the intertestamental period, because that's who the Lord of the Dead was, the underworld, hell. Right? There was also an altar to Zeus at this place in Roman times, and this is where Jesus goes when he traverses up to Bashan a few weeks before he's going to wind up dead, and also venturing into Transjordan Gentile territory to visit more spooky places. This is the site of Peter's confession. Who do men say that I am? Peter says, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, don't get a big head about that. And you didn't figure that out on your own. The Spirit of God had to reveal that to you. And he says, you're Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not be able to withstand it. So again, the Catholics argue, the rock, that's Peter, Petros, Petra, so we should all be Catholics. That means the church is built on Peter. Protestants say, no, Peter's not the rock there. That's a reference back to God, the God of the Old Testament being the rock. 1 Corinthians 10, going back to Deuteronomy. I don't think either of them are correct. I think the rock Jesus is talking about is right where they're standing, because that was known as the gates of hell. So the messaging of Peter's confession has nothing to do with Peter gets to be the leader of the early church. Instead, what Jesus is saying, this is where the church is going to begin, right here. And the gates of hell are not going to be able to prevail against it. I'm going to turn Satan's house into his tomb. So Jesus goes up to Caesarea Philippi and picks a fight at Bonias. And he goes to Mount Hermon 6 days later, because that's what the Gospel says. 6 days later, they went up into the mountain. There's only one mountain there. It's not hard to identify. It's 9,000 feet. Okay, there's nothing else like it. And that's where he's transfigured. Nice place to choose to do that. And right after that, the Gospel says, from this point forward, he began to teach his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and die. It's all deliberate. It's all choreographed. Jesus is picking a fight with the powers of darkness, because it's about time to get the show on the road. It's about time to get the ball rolling. So this was a really special place in New Testament times. This is Bonias. This is the Grotto of Pan. And at the Grotto of Pan, you have an altar there, and you have little niches in the cliff wall where little idols were set in Jesus' day. And so this is again the scene of Matthew 16. This is, it's idolatry central in New Testament times, just like it was in Old Testament times. But in Jesus' day, it was a shrine to Zeus, which was the classical mythological figure for Baal. Okay? He is the lead of the pantheon. And of course, that's why Zeus in books like Revelation, we won't get into 666, but there are definite connections back to Zeus with that number that anyone living in the New Testament era would have understood. So again, this is like ground zero for darkness in the gospel days. Satan's throne becomes associated with a lot of that. This is, put yourself 60, 70 years later. In the Gentile world, the book of Revelation mentions this place a couple times, but here in Revelation 2:13, Jesus says, I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, yet you hold fast my name and do not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was killed among you where Satan dwells. Pergamon was, again, it's a city, the center of Roman government. It was the first city in Asia Minor to build a temple to the Roman ruler, Augustus, who of course claimed to be the lead deity in the political realm. It was also, again, in addition to being focused on Caesar worship, It was also home to the throne-like altar of Zeus, which, believe it or not, has almost entirely survived and is now sitting in a museum in Berlin. It looks like this. This is the seat of Satan. Okay, this is the altar to Zeus from Pergamon. It was literally cut up and transported to this museum in Berlin. And the reason it's kind of interesting, other than the associations, in the book of Revelation, is the decorations that go all the way around the thing. You can see the sculptures here. This was built BC, still around in John's day. But the altar of Zeus was decorated with a frieze depicting a battle between the giants, the Titans, and the Olympian gods, because Zeus is the one that emerges as the big winner in classical literature out of these conflicts. Now, I'm not going to rabbit trail into the gigantomachy, which is a term that just means the battle of the giants, okay? Giant struggle, that sort of thing. But the idea was, there are actually two versions of this story in classical literature. One of them you have the giants who they were giants, they were big, but they weren't full deity. They weren't like the Olympian gods that you and I are sort of familiar with in classical mythology. Zeus, Aphrodite, all those, Apollo, all those figures. The giants were half and half, just like in the Old Testament with the Nephilim. And they went to war with the Olympian gods because the gods had consigned them to Hades, which is in the earth. And the Greco-Roman term for earth was Gaia. So Gaia was a goddess, and she was upset with some of the gods, and so she let them out, and they had this big battle, and Zeus emerges as the leader of the pantheon, which is why they built this altar here to commemorate Zeus's greatness and his victory and whatnot. Of course, Zeus becomes the Satan figure when you get into the New Testament era for Christians. So it's referenced, this whole thing about this is like ground zero for Satan. You poor people at Pergamon, are living like with this in your backyard. And, John points it out there in the book of Revelation as one of the churches that he speaks to. And it was huge. It's 40 feet high. And if we go back to the picture, it's a good size, chunk of granite or marble. And here's some close-ups. Again, it's been effaced in places, but there's a specific sequence, to it so that people can kind of work their way through the story and work their way, through the episode. But if you go to Berlin, you can see the thing, in real time. Away from sights and objects, back to texts. Again, we're just going through a survey here. It's just some things that you may have heard of, may have not heard of. This one you probably have heard of, but you may not know it. The Nag Hammadi texts. How many of you have ever seen that term before? Okay, handful, couple. What's the more familiar term for the Nag Hammadi Gospels? The Gnostic Gospels. Remember the Da Vinci Code? Okay, this is what supposedly Dan Brown's story is drawn from. So the Nag Hammadi texts were discovered in Egypt, in Nag Hammadi, right here it is. This is going to sound weird, but this is Upper Egypt, this is Lower Egypt. Don't be misled by the map. It's a geographical term because it's higher here and down here's the low country. So the water goes that way. So Upper and Lower Egypt. So Nag Hammadi is in Upper Egypt. And specifically, we have mid-20th century, 1945. There was just again, random discovery, somebody out herding goats, discovered what looks like sort of books in sleeves. Right, here's a picture. Here are some others. They're in varying degrees of, wholeness, I guess you could say. But inside the animal skin coverings, you had essentially books. And you could flip them over and whatnot. They weren't scrolls, they were in book form, they were codex form. And again, here you have some insects that have eaten through a lot of the content, but whatnot. But there were a bunch of these just sitting there. And they date to 2nd, 3rd, 4th, well, 2nd's probably generous. 3rd, 4th, 5th century AD. So a little bit post of the New Testament era. They're eventually taken to the museum in Cairo. And ultimately, what they were was they were sacred writings to Gnostic Christians. Now, I realize that might sound like an oxymoron, Gnostic Christian. Gnosticism is not Orthodox Christianity. Okay? And Gnostics will bitterly fight you over, well, the fact that we're not Orthodox is an accident of history, and Emperor Constantine decided the theology that all the mainstream Christians believe in, and Gnosticism is really what we all should have been. Okay, there's a lot of nonsense that goes with that, but Gnostic Christianity is not an oxymoron because they have a very high view of Christ. It's just not the one that you would be familiar with from something like the Nicene Creed. Okay, Gnostic Christianity is a little bit different. Actually, it's a lot different in certain ways. But when it comes to its Christology, it's uneven. Some Gnostic texts will have Jesus dying on the cross and rising again. Others will say, well, it wasn't really Jesus, it was like a phantom that looked like Jesus, made like a hologram or something. It wasn't really in a body. Others will say, well, yeah, there was this guy, Jesus, who did die, and then, some deity form, floated down on him, and that's what rose again. There's all sorts of just strange Christologies associated with Gnosticism. That theology is what is preserved in these texts. You also get alternative gospels in these texts. But a Gnostic gospel is not like the gospel you're thinking of. The gospel you're thinking of from the New Testament is like a record of somebody's life, kind of like a biography, even though the Gospels aren't truly biographical in terms of how they're written. They have biographical information in them, but it's not a whole record of somebody's life. Like, if you think about the Gospels, part of it is Jesus' life, and then most of it is like what Jesus taught. So it's not like a pure biography. It's kind of like a biography with like an anthology of teaching. Gnostic stuff, there's no biographical information almost at all. It's all just a bunch of weird theological talk. But it's about the disciples. It's about Jesus. Mary Magdalene is a more prominent figure in the Gnostic Gospels than she is in the canonical Gospels. And so, you have this alternative gospel kind of thing going on. And it's because, think about it, you're 200 or 300 years after the founding of the church. People are wondering, well, how do we understand this stuff? Like, who was Jesus? Was he God? Did he have two natures or one nature? Was he really deity in flesh, or was he like a man that deity came on and lived with for a while, or lived in for a while and he left? All of these Christological debates were part of early church history. And when you have important councils like Nicaea, the job for something like the Council of Nicaea was not, well, let's vote on the one we like, even though that's the way it sort of gets talked about. What they're trying to do is they're trying to come to grips with what does the New Testament actually teach. We need to figure that out, and then we need to land on it, and we need to stamp that as this is what the New Testament teaches, and this is where we're going to plant our flag. So we have something like the Nicene Creed, which specifically denied, in that context, it was something called Arianism. Arianism taught that there was a time when the Son was not, a time when Jesus didn't exist, so they didn't believe in a Trinity or anything like that. But even those guys after Nicaea are still referred to as Christians, because they did believe that Jesus was the lone source of salvation and stuff like that. A lot of the debates were on how do we understand Trinity and Christology and stuff like that. So a lot of that discussion comes from here. The reason why this is current in pop culture is the Da Vinci Code. Now, The Gnostic material was eventually, again, published. This is a real rough history of it. 1966, there was a conference held, again, so 20 years after the discovery, a bunch of scholars get together and say, hey, we need to translate this stuff, put it into English. There was a facsimile edition published in 12 volumes that, they're not photographs, but you can get photographic plates, but they're reproductions, drawings and that sort of thing, and a lot of photography. And eventually it gets published in this book that you see here. This is the most recent cover, the most recent edition. Nag Hammadi Library in English. Translation of the Gnostic Scriptures completed in one volume. This is part of a transcription. And I'm showing you this for a very specific reason. How many of you read the Da Vinci Code or saw the movie? Okay, a few guilty parties. I read it. I was about 50 pages in and I knew where it was going. I was into Jesus' bloodline mythology before the Da Vinci Code, so I kind of knew where this was headed. But it was still a fun read.
Curiosity.
Yeah. It was. I would say it was clever, but if you remember the controversy about the book, inside the book, like the first page or so, I think it was even before you hit the preface, there was something about how this novel was based upon, deep scholarship or something like that, and that's what made people just have a canary, because what Dan Brown did in the book was he referred to this passage at one point in the book. This is a scene where Jesus is with Mary Magdalene, and Dan Brown has it in the book, has Jesus kissing her on the mouth. And then he argued that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married. And that just blew the whole thing up. And he sold millions and millions of copies, because it created this huge firestorm of controversy. But the problem is, if you actually look at the scholarly transcriptions of the Nag Hammadi Codex, there is no word for mouth in the text. It's literally not there. And the footnote down here will tell you, well, there's enough spaces in the text that it could read her mouth, or her feet, or her cheek, or her forehead. All Coptic words for those things could fit in that space. So what Dan Brown did was cheat. Okay? He misdirects you. He doesn't tell his readers, or he doesn't have his characters give you the truth that there's a gap here. We don't know what it said. And there's no other place in the entire, I have a whole, if you want to go to YouTube, I have a whole lecture on Jesus and Mary Magdalene in the Gnostic Gospels, where I do exciting things like search the Gnostic Gospels, because Logos has an edition of these. It's real easy to search it. I search for all the occurrences of Mary and Jesus and the word marry or married, or the word wife and husband. There isn't a single line in any Gnostic text that has the two of them married. Now that's boring video to watch Mike searching things in software, but it's effective. Okay? There isn't a single line that says that. And I don't really care. I think there are reasons why Jesus wasn't married, or that he most likely wasn't. On one level, it wouldn't have mattered. I think the reason it would have was because what do you do with offspring? Because there would have been this sense of, well, did he inherit God particles in him or something? They're like, what do you do with the kids? I think that's why that whole issue, is just something that's not, part of the Jesus story, part of what he was doing while he was here. But Brown sensationalized this and became an uber millionaire because of it, because it was pardon the pun, it was a sexy story, to have Jesus be married and have an ancient text say that. That was contemporary with the Gospels. And then, of course, bringing the whole church historical fight over what is correct Christology and what isn't. So it's kind of a perfect storm. Gnostic Gospels and Jesus being married was in the news. It's been in the news for the last 3 or 4 years, but most recently, a week ago. Does anyone recognize who this person is? This is Karen King from Harvard University. She is a Gnostic scholar. She's a scholar of Gnostic texts. I don't know if she's a Gnostic, but she's a scholar of Gnostic texts at Harvard. And somebody sent her this fragment a few years ago. And it refers to the wife of Jesus. Now, unwisely, she let this become known. And this became huge news a couple of years ago. Now, if you're interested in the topic, you get the slides. Go to this article in The Atlantic from a week ago, because it has now been fully exposed as a hoax. And The Atlantic has a long, it reads like one of those Jason Bourne, novel. I mean, just how the people involved did what they did to dupe Karen King. I mean, it's got spies in it, it's got violence, it's got, all sorts of intrigue to basically put one over on her. And King has essentially owned, I should have looked into this a little bit more. But, she didn't. Now, before this article, scholars were quick to go after this. People of all stripes, whether they were evangelicals who specialized in Coptic and Gnostic studies, or people who didn't believe anything at all. And this is where you get the technical discussion of how the forger did it, and the fact that it was a forgery. What he did, have you ever, this will date anybody who's read this book or seen the movie, The Word by Irving Wallace. It was made into a movie that was starred David Jansen. Okay, this is before anybody's dying. If you can find it, it's not on DVD, but trust me, I've tried to find a copy of it. But I saw it when it was on TV one time. And it's almost exactly the same thing. It's an authentic forgery. So how do you create an authentic forgery? What you do is you go to old museum libraries where they have codexes. And while no one's looking, you cut a blank page out of the back of one of them. Because in most codexes, there are blank pages. So then it dates to the 2nd century. Then what you have to do is you have to know the recipe from similar manuscripts of what the ink was made of and how to reproduce it, using only materials available at the time. You can get that from journal articles, okay, because they tell you that sort of stuff. And so if you have those two ingredients, and this guy did, what you do then is you find someone reasonably coherent in Coptic, and you have him copy lines out of different texts and paste them together. And you create your own text. The problem is when you do that, you make grammatical errors. Okay, you goof. And this one has a couple goofs in it that people, again, who are specialists in the field just recognized after looking at the text a few times. So they knew that it was a fake, but they really didn't know who was behind it. But King kept denying it all along, because it was, she didn't want to get embarrassed. And so that's where the Atlantic article comes in. Somebody tracked down all the particulars. And so, no, there is no Jesus wife Coptic fragment, unless you're talking about the one that was a fake. And that one does exist. She's holding it there, but it's not authentic. There are authentic papyri. Just a few pictures of New Testament papyri here. I mean, archaeology is responsible for the fact that you have a New Testament based on manuscripts that are older than the Middle Ages. Okay, just like the Dead Sea Scrolls, when I mentioned them earlier on, we've had a course here on stuff that the New Testament writers would have read. In the case of the Old Testament, prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls being discovered, the oldest complete manuscript of the Old Testament was dated 1008 AD. We know that because the scribe put the date on it. Dead Sea Scrolls immediately move you back in time 1,000 years, like overnight. Now, the New Testament, it's not that dramatic, but it's still significant, because prior to the discovery of papyri, if you took the papyri out of the equation, let's just put it this way, you would have probably your best Old New Testament witnesses would be 4th or 5th century AD, so that's 400 years after the fact. The papyri can get you back another couple hundred years to within one and a half generations of the apostles. And there are some of them, I don't know if I have this one in particular up here, I might. And this is what they look like. By the way, you see this line right here, row of letters? Somebody squeezed in 2 letters up here. Somebody made a boo-boo. Okay, and the next guy catches it and says, oh, got to correct that. Put that, just like you would do. If you wrote a note, a little caret there, like, don't forget these 2 letters or else you're going to mess it up. I mean, they would do this because you can't just go buy another piece of papyrus down at Rite Aid. Okay, you use what you have because there ain't a whole lot where that came from. So they do stuff like this all the time. This one, yeah, right over here. This is P. Well, if Rick was here, he could tell me, right? I don't want to get into this too much because the next, we have July off. In August, we're having Doug Mangum and Rick Brannon are going to do How We Got the Old and New Testament. 2 weeks Old Testament, 2 weeks New Testament. They'll be going into a lot of this stuff. I think this is it's either P72 or papyrus number 72. This one goes back to about the 130s, the 140s AD. It's one of the oldest papyri that we have, and it's a portion of John, chapter 18. Dead Sea Scrolls for the New Testament. Dead Sea Scrolls are not just important for Old Testament. Some of the stuff, you don't have any portions of the New Testament in the Dead Sea Scrolls, although scholars for many years argued for one fragment that was about as big as my thumb. That was supposed to come from Mark. There are a handful of Greek Dead Sea Scrolls, but nobody really buys that anymore. It's just a few letters, how are you going to tell? But some of them talk about, topically, things that are relevant to the New Testament. Again, most of this stuff comes from the intertestamental period, a couple hundred years before Jesus. And so you're going to have Jews writing about things they do, things they believe, prior to the coming of Jesus. And a lot of that stuff concerns Messiah. It concerns Old Testament interpretation. If you ever wondered, how did Jews interpret the Old Testament before Jesus came along? What were they thinking about Messiah? What were they thinking about, fill in the blank? How did they interpret this or that passage? Dead Sea Scrolls will actually get into that, and it gives you some insight into what they were thinking. And then you can compare that to, well, what did Jesus teach? What's in the Gospels? What did Paul say about this or that? How did Paul interpret the Old Testament as opposed to some scribe living a couple hundred years before? This is known as 4QMMT, this particular fragment. That's famous for a couple of things. One is the saying in it, you believe but we say, which is very close to you have heard but I say unto you in the Sermon on the Mount. People have noticed that. And is it a stylistic device? Is it something more than that? Certainly if you have a person who's saying I'm the Messiah, it's a little bit more than that. But it's a familiar rhetorical device. Okay. 4QMMT is also interesting because it talks about the works of the law, which is a big deal in Paul's theology, and how Jews of this day understood the works of the law. There's a big debate, in part caused by Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts, that goes something like this. Did Jews really believe? Could you really get this out of a Jew living in Jesus' day? Did they really believe that they could keep the law and go to heaven? Spend eternity with the Lord. In other words, did they really believe in works salvation? Because we're sort of reflexively taught that. That's the way Paul is read. But it's actually pretty hard to prove that case. And if you think about your Old Testament, salvation was by grace through faith in the Old Testament as well. It's just the particular things you had to embrace and believe were pre-cross. You had to believe Yahweh was the God of gods, you worship no other, he's the creator of all the others. You had to believe a certain small set of things, and then he had entered into a covenant relationship with you. And if you believe these things about him, then you trust that that's what he wants. If I believe these things about him, then when I die, I'll be with him. My loyalty, I'm assigning my loyalty to him and no other. Okay, the Shema, the Lord our God is one. We worship no other. So that isn't works. Okay, now we have the whole law system. So if we can say that salvation is by faith consistently across both testaments, then do we really want to say that Jews couldn't figure that out? Okay, because if they did figure it out, then the question becomes, well, what was Paul shooting at then about the works of the law? And why does Paul have a high view of the law in Romans 7? Remember Romans 7? Paul struggling, with sin. And he says, I delight in the law of God after the inward man. But his struggle was with the flesh. Who shall deliver me from the body of this death? So Paul had a high view of the law. What it really comes down to is Paul had a high view of the law, but he had a higher view of Jesus. Okay, you can go do the law all you want. The law is a good thing. You're not going to go wrong if you obey God. But if you do that and Jesus is absent from your belief system, from your faith, it's not going to avail you anything. That's really what Paul's targeting. It's not go live like you want. Who gives a rip about the law? I hate the law. Paul never says that. And there were Jews, again, in this one text in particular, testify to the fact that, they had a high view of the law, but that wasn't to dismiss the idea of there are things we need to believe to be in a right relationship with the God of Israel. So this one's gotten a lot of attention. John the Baptist is often in fringe literature. Whenever you hear me refer to fringe literature, you can fill in internet. Okay. Lots of talk on the internet about how John the Baptist was a member of the Essene community where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay. There's no scroll that says that. There are misalignments. There are things that really get in the way. It'd be nice because it would give you a chronological link, but that isn't the case. But what you do have in certain scrolls is you do have shared property among the community there where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. The Essenes is the dominant view for who these people were. It's not the only view, but the dominant one. And they were believers who had all things in common, or they shared common property, so that sounds a little bit like the book of Acts. They had a communal meal with bread and wine. They talked about the Messiah a lot. They talked about the end of the world a lot. And these things have certifiable links into the New Testament. And that might sound to our ear like, ooh, that's spooky. Maybe like there's some relationship here. But what you really need to how you really need to process it is all of these things that you associate with the New Testament have deep Old Testament roots. And it's very normal for Jews living in the intertestamental period to be thinking about their Old Testament, thinking about the kingdom of God, thinking about the Messiah, thinking about right versus wrong, thinking about how is all this going to end, when are we going to get rid of the Romans, when's the kingdom coming back. All of these things, if you're a Jew, you're thinking about them. You're writing about them, you're saying things about them, and there's going to be overlap with the New Testament because guess what? All those guys were Jews too. I mean, they were. That's who the apostles were. So you'll read whole books, and there are movies, on YouTube, and again, lots of stuff on the internet about, this is really where Christianity comes from. This wacky group out in the desert. The Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls and all this sort of stuff. And you'll hear people talk about, well, this is why there was such a conspiracy to keep the scrolls hidden for decades. Scholars, squirreling them away in their offices and refusing to publish them and blah, 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 blah. They're just whole grand conspiracy theories erected over this. If you're interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls, James Vander Kim has a really nice book. That's an introduction to the Dead Sea Scrolls Today. He has a whole chapter on why the conspiracy theory is stupid. Okay, that's not the title of the chapter, but that's what the chapter is about. And he does something very simple. He runs down the list of publication dates. The scrolls began to be published in the 50s. It's less than a decade after they were discovered. And they have been published and were published in succeeding years, every year hence. It just takes a long time when you discover, like in Cave 4, 100,000 fragments of a scroll buried under a foot of bat dung. Okay? That just takes a while to get all that stuff out, clean it up, and then you have a 100,000 piece puzzle piece with no cover lid to cheat off of. Okay, that's what you're dealing with. So yeah, it's going to take a while. And even today, they have, for that cave, a lot of it is still unassembled because who knows? You don't really know how. I mean, people are still trying to literally. I mean, I know a guy at Northwestern. This is his thing, the Dead Sea Scrolls scholar. And in his house, he's got one of these things with the light, like on the table, this box that has the light, through. And he'll sit there with facsimiles of scrolls, just moving them around the table. Hey, does this edge match this one? Does that make any? This is what he does. He loves it. I'm glad somebody loves that because I would just kind of lose my mind doing that. But this is what he does, and he's not the only one. They're still at it. This is 70 years later. Now, other than Cave 4, most of it's been published. Most of it's been translated into English. Did Christianity die and disappears in the last 70 years? Is it still here? It's not a trick question. Yes, it's still here. In other words, there was nothing in the scrolls that upended anything. So the conspiracy theorists are really looking kind of dumb. It's all out there. You can just go read it. I used to assign it for class. I didn't lose anybody in the classes I taught. Again, it's a lot of brouhaha over nothing. Now this is a big deal. The next two things here. Time check. What time is it? If we can fly through.
20.
What? 20? Okay. Now this one, there's two things here that are related. The James ossuary and the what's called by some the Jesus tomb. The technical term is Talpiot B. Ossuary, of course, bone box. This is a very famous one. This is probably the most famous bone box in the world, even more than Caiaphas, because on this one there's an inscription. You can barely see it here. It's a pretty neat hand. Down here is a transcription of it. This is James, the brother of Joseph. James, the brother of Joseph, the brother of Yeshua, Jesus. So you have James and Jesus mentioned in the same inscription. And we know from the New Testament that one of Jesus' brothers was Yaakov in Hebrew, or James in Greek, and of course English. So this ossuary has, when it was discovered, was a really big deal because this would be like the bone box of one of the Lord's brothers. And it actually has Yeshua on the inscription as well. This was part of a collection by this guy. This is Oded Golan. And if you subscribe to Biblical Archaeology Review, you probably never want to hear this guy's name again, because every issue for the last 10 years has been dominated by this story. Look at the dates. December 2004, the Israeli Justice Ministry charged Golan and 3 other Israelis, one of whom was a pretty famous epigrapher, and 1 Palestinian with running a forgery ring that had been operating for 20 years. And among the objects that the Israeli Antiquities Authorities identified as a forgery, ivory pomegranate is mentioned. I actually had to study this in graduate school. I mean, if that's a forgery, somebody did a really good job. But this box was named in the indictment. There were lots of people who thought that this was a forgery. And Golan denied the charges, but since some of this other stuff came out as, yeah, that was faked, when they arrested Golan, this became part of the equation, this box. Now, 2007, it's 3 years later, so it took 3 years to get him into the court. The defense, okay, catch this, the defense produced photographs taken in Golan's home that were dated to 1976. Now, that was important because one of the photographs shows the ossuary on the shelf in his house, and you can see the whole inscription on it. So the photographs, again, come from the 70s, which meant this cannot be a recent forgery in the last 20 years. So Golan wound up being acquitted. 2 paleographers believe that the inscription is authentic. Lemaire, again, is a big name in epigraphy, and so is Yardeni. She does more scripts than anything, but no paleographer to date, no epigrapher to date has challenged their conclusions. So in 2012, he finally got off the hook after the whole appeal process that took 8 years for this guy to go through the court system. This was a huge case in Israel. And the judge said there's no evidence that any of the major artifacts were forged. The prosecution has failed to make their case. And Golan went free. So everybody was thrilled about that until this came along. Now, this is 2007, so it was right around after the sort of the first initial decisions of the Golan trial. Conference held at New York Public Library. Director James Cameron, yes, this is the guy from Titanic and Avatar. It's that James Cameron who hates Christianity, by the way. And Simcha Yakubovich to discuss their documentary, The Lost Tomb of Jesus, which discusses the 1980 findings of the Talpiot tomb, which they claim is in fact Jesus' family tomb. This is the outside of it. It was discovered in there was a site, an area being cleared for construction. They were going to build a parking lot or something. And this was discovered in 1980. Okay, think about that, 1980. This is the inside. If you go inside, there's these little niches. The little squares here are bone boxes. In the original excavation, okay, there are more bone boxes mentioned in the 1980 find. They just resealed it. They didn't do anything with it. But there were more bone boxes than there were when news of the James ossuary became big because of the Golan trial. There was one missing. So there were originally 10, but when they went to check the shelves during the trial, there was one missing. And so there are people like Jakobovich and Cameron that say the missing ossuary is the James ossuary. That's number 10. And if it's number 10, and it's just been ruled authentic, then that's a feather in our cap. And why do they want the feather in their cap? Well, because in this particular tomb, there were bone boxes for Mary. Let's see if I can get the list right here. Mary, Matthew, but he wasn't a blood relative. A second Mary, Jesus, Yosef, James. Yosef was it like a pet name for, who was it, Mark? I mean, there are like 7 or 8 names associated in the gospel stories in this tomb. So when news of this broke, that was 2007. Now, I had actually done a paper on this thing about 3 or 4 years before this, so I knew what this was. I'd done a conference paper on it. And 2007, providentially, was the year that the ETS had its regional meeting in Oregon, which I attended, and Darrell Bach was there. I don't know if you've probably heard of Darrell Bach. He's written a lot of stuff for the church. He teaches at Dallas Seminary. I was talking with him after his session. He goes, man, I got to get on a plane. I got to go to New York, and I got to go to this press conference, and they're having this thing about the Talpiot tomb, and I'm supposed to be the evangelical counterpoint. I said, really? I said, you mean this one? He's like, yeah, where did you hear about all this? It's like, this has been known since 1980. So I gave him a copy of my paper. Shot it to him in email. He reads it on the plane, it helps him out at the press conference. Well, the big deal was, again, the collection of names. So this just was like, for Cameron, this is like, yes, this is it. I'm going to get rid of Christianity and all this kind of stuff. Okay, scholars from the atheistic corner all the way up to the evangelical corner went after this thing, as you can imagine. And there are lots of problems with it. The names in the tomb and the names in the Gospels are among the most common in the first century. There are, it's been a while since I looked at this, at least three, maybe four ossuaries with the name Jesus on it. And there's at least one more, Jesus, son of Joseph. There are two of those. So, unless you got multiple burials and crucifixions and resurrections, it ain't, you got a problem there. So you've got a problem with the names, and there's all sorts of other intrigue about it. And if you want to read again, I would recommend reading this paper. Okay, I gave Michelle a copy of my paper because it has images in it. There are some serious problems with the names. And let me just give you an illustration. Okay, all the names are there, but there are no what are called patronyms. What's a patronym, you ask? That tells you how you're related. So, Jesus and Mary, for instance, Cameron wants to say, this is Mary Magdalene. They were married. The Gnostic Gospels say they were married. The Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown. Look, Jesus, and they even did, there were bone fragments in that one, so they did DNA analysis. Yeah, they're not from the same family, they're different people, and they could have been husband and wife. Yeah, they could have been like aunt and uncle. They could have been like, on both two sides of the family. They could have been, some other remote family relationship that doesn't fall within the DNA. I mean, there could have been 3 or 4 different combinations just for that one. And you do the same thing with all the others. Plus, there's another site in Israel that has like 5 of the apostolic names in it in the same tomb. And some of them overlap with this one. Okay, these are common names. And again, and that's just sort of the most transparent problem with it. So if you're interested in it, again, we're living in 2016. Okay, we're still here. Princeton did a whole write-up on this issue. Overwhelmingly, the papers in this volume are skeptical, again, pointing out things that they just don't work. To me, it doesn't pass the logic test to begin with. Let's say that none of the other problems exist. See this picture back here? Okay, this would have been on the street. And Cameron says this was a sign because this is a Gnostic symbol. This is a sign of the tomb of Jesus. So in other words, all of the Jews in the 1st century and the 2nd century, and all the Romans who walked by and saw this, okay, nobody shut down the apostles. Nobody produced any amount of writing that said, these people are nuts because we can go visit the guy's tomb. Nobody does that? Really? I mean, even in the Gospels, they say, that there's this whole thing about producing the body. So for 300 years, people walked by this and nobody said boo. That just doesn't seem coherent. Somebody would have said something. And how, even if they never wrote anything down, how did the thing survive? How would you have people living in the 1st century believe what the apostles preached when they could just as well go down the street and see that they were wrong? The answer is because you couldn't just go down the street and see that they were wrong. So there's kind of a stink factor to the whole thing. But it was news, back in 2007. It doesn't get trucked out too much now because it got a lot of attention and it got a lot of heavy debunking. If you're into math, you would want to read these if you're a math guy or an engineer. This is a friend of mine, Randy Ingermanson. He was the first person I called after Darrell Bach told me they were going to have a conference on this, because Randy is a computational physicist and he does computational statistics. Okay, Randy published several papers about doing a statistical analysis on the names of the tomb. So this thing has been going backward and forward and whatever. But I picked it, I wanted to include it here because these are the sorts of things you will run into at the grocery stand and on the internet. This is what you'll run into. You won't run into some of the dry and dusty stuff that academics do. You'll run into Gnostic Gospels. Okay, you'll run into Dead Sea Scrolls. You'll run into the Jesus tomb, Talpiot B. Okay, you'll run into stuff like that. And typically what you get is I hate to say it, but you often get only one side of the story, the one that sells the most or the one that is most hostile, okay, to Judeo-Christianity. But even if they try to be fair, you'll only get just the surface level of what's going on. You have to know that there are resources out there where you can start drilling down into all these things. And people spend a lot of time on it. They really do. Whether they're evangelical or not, like Bart Ehrman, the famous atheist guy, New Testament scholar at NC State, he's not buying any of this. He got into a lot of trouble with the militant atheist community because he wrote a book in defense of the historicity of Jesus. Even though he doesn't believe anything about Jesus, but at least he's honest in that respect. He's not buying any of this. So be thankful for people like Bart Ehrman, even if they just make you grind your teeth, most of the day. You still have them. They're still out there, and they're still doing good work. Questions? Go to the website. Michelle, I sent the paper and the links. If you want to, again, read some of the stuff, you can. But just so that you know it's out there. Right? Okay. Yes, sir.
In the past, I've seen a lot of stuff on the what they call the Shroud of...
The Shroud of Turin, yeah.
Yes. What's the background story?
It's still, I'm trying to remember what decade it was. I think it was the 70s, seems too old. It's been carbon dated. And the carbon dating of the shroud unanimously points to the Middle Ages. Now, prior to the carbon dating, there were some things about the shroud that led people to think that they had a first century object. Namely, there were pollen, what's the right word? I'm not a science guy. Was it molecules or something like that? There were pollen fragments on the shroud that could be dated by botanists and paleobotanists. And they're there, so, some people would say, well, that proves the cloth existed, maybe not the image. Maybe, again, we had a case where we take an old object and we put an image on it. Now, I've seen 2 or 3 science shows of how, using medieval tools, medieval artists, certain techniques, I have seen people reproduce images on shrouds, and it's doable. Now, that doesn't mean that this was that, but it just means that it's doable. So I tend to think that this will not get an adequate resolution until they carbon date it again, because the charge was, and there's some legitimacy to this, because where they cut the fragment, they cut it from the outside of the shroud, which, you're not going to say, hand me the scissors so I can go right in the middle of it, and just bugger the whole thing up. But they cut from a portion that arguably probably was touched a lot. And so the issue of contamination was very quickly thrown into the mix, because if you touch an object, you can leave, residue, at the chemical level, and it could throw off a date. So that's what shroud believers are arguing about the C14 test. And I think the only way it's going to get resolved is to redo the test, redo it from a portion that you're not going to have a lot of handling. But even with that, there's a problem, because if you know anything about the shroud, the lines on either side of the image and all the kind of black marks on it, it went through a fire. Well, that can leave a residue too. So the question is there any part of the shroud that is like pristine? The answer is probably not. So even if they did it again, if he gets medieval second time around, people are going to argue the same thing. So is there really a way to establish this? Now, there's no procedurally, the Gospels don't give us a whole lot. It does give us the thing about the head wrapping, which was separate from the clothing. So the question, like biblically speaking, you could say, well, how in the world could you get a facial impression if the head was also wrapped in a separate cloth? And the answer is, nobody really knows. But again, the argument goes, well, before you put that on, maybe they covered it. Who knows? Nobody really knows, what precisely was done with the body and what was used and all that kind of stuff in terms of, was this shroud actually used? Did they actually do this kind of thing? Some people will come up with evidence that suggests it. Others will come up with stuff that suggests they didn't. Seeing paintings from the Middle Ages where they're draping a body from the cross and the shroud aren't helpful, because they're medieval. They're not photographs. Okay, they're artistic conceptions of how the artist imagined the body would be handled. The shroud itself, historically, references to a cloth object that was associated with the burial of Egypt. It goes back to Edessa, which is about the 4th century. Is that this? I don't know. There are people who build a case that that's this, but you still have 200 or 300 years that you don't have. I kind of think it's a dead end. I don't think the church, the Catholic Church, will ever give permission again to test the shroud, especially if people want to remove something from something that isn't the edges. They allowed it the first time, so there's precedent for that, but I don't know what they'd have to gain. I'd be real surprised if they ever did it again. But it's interesting. I don't think it's conclusively, this can't be authentic. I'm on the side of it's probably not. But I don't know that I could say that this is just definitely, there's like a no way here. It doesn't look good. But I don't really care, because I don't invest any theological content into the shroud. Some people do, but I don't. Anybody else? Okay, thank you for coming.